Welcome to another episode of the Time for Impact podcast. I'm Chris Wade from Time for Impact, and I'm here with my co-host, Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Chris. Hope you're doing all right. Have you had a good week?
It's Monday, Matt, but the week's been okay so far. Yeah,
Excellent.
for
Good.
sure.
Good to hear.
Yeah, as always, and our regular listeners will know, on each episode of the podcast, we try to bring somebody in who's doing something or done something kind of innovative or creative in the world of volunteering, or who's just inspired us with their work around their volunteering history and their volunteering organisations that they've worked with. And, well, of course, we wouldn't be breaking that trend today, would we? So we're really pleased to be joined by Ed Bracher today. He is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Dogs for Good, and I'm sure, no doubt, we'll tell you all about that in a second. But Matt and I have followed Ed's career for a while. Matt has worked for Ed, and we've always been very impressed by his attitude and working with volunteers. And it's good to, I think, to have a viewpoint from an acting and experienced CEO about volunteering on this podcast. So, hi, Ed, how are you?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, very well, thanks. Hi, Matt. Nice to see you both. Yeah, no, I'm very well. Very well.
Good.
So, yeah, I know. Well, thanks for that intro. I've worked in the voluntary sector now for, I hate to admit it, but about 35 years. First of all, briefly as a volunteer, but then working with volunteers. So I consider myself a volunteerist in all the positive senses of that word.
Brilliant. And maybe you might want to tell us a bit about that history.
Yeah. So I worked abroad, first volunteering with VSO, and then doing a bit of volunteer management with young people, and then came back to the UK, ran an international, or was the ops director of an international youth volunteering organisation. Then went and worked for Riding for the Disabled as the CEO there for quite a long time. That's where I work with Matt, which is a significant volunteering organisation, has about 18,000 volunteers to about 40 staff. So very much a volunteer-led organisation, and relying on volunteers to deliver quite a big impact. And more recently, as you say, I've moved across to work with Dogs Not Horses, Dogs for Good, where we provide sort of connections for people and support for people living with a variety of different challenges and conditions with our dogs. And those dogs are largely trained and socialised by our volunteers, working alongside our staff. So it's a different kind of volunteering atmosphere. Fewer volunteers, or for the moment anyway, and we have about 700 volunteers at the moment, but very invested in what we do. Volunteering at all sorts of different scales, and achieving some real significant impact, which is exciting.
Yeah, good. It's good to hear. There's a hint of ambition, not 700 so far. It's always good to hear.
Well, it was 600 a year ago, so we're doing okay. We've
The
got 100
trajectory's
new volunteers last year.
Yeah, good stuff. And Ed, what would you say from your experience of working with lots of really strong volunteering charities, but certainly the two recent ones that you've had a big role in as CEO? What would you say is your vision or your philosophy around volunteering?
So I think it's that's a huge question, Chris. But I think the vision is, I describe it as a one-team approach. Volunteers and paid colleagues, recognising that both have something to bring to the party. It may be different, but working alongside each other. It might sound a bit idealistic to say sort of working equally, but recognising each has a bit to bring, and one benefits from the other. And I've seen it on both sides, where you get, I think probably when I started at RDA, there was an interesting culture there. The organisation was very, very much volunteer led. When I started there, I think there were only 8 members of staff, and there was a bit of an attitude, particularly from some of the more senior volunteers, that the staff were there to serve the volunteers and maybe not contribute too much. And that was something we set out to change, so that staff and volunteers work alongside each other, and getting that kind of mutual sense of trust, respect, and teamwork. So where you get everyone working alongside each other as a single team, that works really well. And indeed, our plan and our ambition at Dogs for Good is to engage volunteers in a bit more of our process. And as I've been at pains to be clear with my colleagues, that's not absolutely not so that we can replace staff with volunteers, but it's so we can increase capacity. And we've got, there are volunteers out there who can really bring something to it, and have got quite a lot of experience that they want to bring to bear. So we can support that and do more by doing so.
It's one of the things that certainly I definitely took away from the time we worked together, and it's something we've talked quite a lot about on this podcast as well, is this, and you've just mentioned it there straight off, which is really interesting, this notion of trust in volunteers. And I think it's interesting because I spent a lot of time at RDA, and where volunteers in many ways, right, like make some big decisions about what happens when and who does what. Looking at other organizations and things, that doesn't always seem to be the case. It's not always, not all organizations seem to sort of trust volunteers easily. What would you say, or from your experience, is the kind of, what's the secret ingredient to trusting volunteers? How do you build a culture of that, or how do you sustain a culture of that in an organization?
It's a really interesting question, actually. And someone said to me not that long ago that they said that the problem, I'll use their word, the problem with working with volunteers is you can't always give them something responsible to do. And I thought, well, exactly as you said, Matt, I immediately thought we've got volunteers at RDA who are making the choice whether someone with quite a severe level of impairment can sit on the back of a horse or not. And they can do that because we trust them, because they've had all the training and support they need to help make that decision. And if they feel unable to, they know there's backup that they can call on to help them with that decision. So I think it's really interesting. My view is it depends where you've come from. So RDA is an organisation that was started by volunteers and ran for about 10 years before it employed anybody. So the culture of the organisation and volunteering within it is really, really deeply embedded. You get other organisations like Dogs for Good, where I am now, that was started by a group of people who raised the money and got it going, and then chose to engage volunteers to allow us to do more of the process. So I think what that second model risks is creating a kind of transactional relationship with your volunteers when they're just people who do a task. And it's really interesting when, someone's saying you can't give a volunteer a responsible job, and then, we give our volunteers an 8-week-old puppy and ask them to look after it for nearly 2 years and give it back to us as a well-socialized, calm and ready to go dog. So that's a pretty critical thing that we're asking our volunteers to do. And I think that the real key answer to your question, I think, Matt, is around, firstly, being really clear about who's doing what the roles are. It's not quite as black and white as making sure the role description's perfect, but actually just being really clear. And that helps set some expectations as to who's doing what. And I think also there's a reliance, or there's a responsibility on the organisation to be clear about what the volunteer wants out of the relationship, because some volunteers, they want to get deeply involved and want to do quite a lot and help make those decisions and help get involved. And there are other people who want to turn up once a week and do their 2-hour bit and feel engaged with that bit, but don't want to take it home and don't want to be doing anything else. And both of those are fine and both of those are important. But you need to make sure as an organisation you respect the choices of the volunteer. And I think for me also, and interesting given the title of this podcast, I think there's also something about recognising that the impact that the charity has is delivered by volunteers as well as everybody else. It's back to my banter about a one team approach. It's the whole team that delivers the impact, and actually recognising that the volunteers deliver that impact as well as everybody else is really important. And that helps volunteers become advocates for what you do, and it helps them sell what you do to other people. And quite rightly, it allows them to feel proud about what they achieve. So a big part of, and a rather kind of brilliant part of what our organisation does, is bringing volunteers who've socialised small puppies back together in future years with the client who's got that dog as an adult, and they can meet that client, meet the dog again. Everyone can go mad and gooey about having a lovely dog, but they can also actually just feel a bit proud and excited about what their bit of volunteering has helped achieve.
It seems like what you've got going on there is kind of what other perhaps more fundraising orientated sort of mindset might be around like stewardship, and you're seeing there's a really key sort of stewardship of not just of like donations in terms of money, but also donations of time, like looking after those people and taking them on a journey, and meeting them at key touch points, or keeping them connected to the cause is, it's as important for someone that's giving their time as it is important for someone that's giving their money, right? It's just perhaps
Yeah,
looks and feels a little bit different.
yeah, I think so. And we have a lot of volunteers doing fundraising and other roles as well, and it's important to remember the same applies for them. So I had an interesting experience recently with a volunteer who, and I'm putting inverted commas around the word just here, but they'd been a volunteer for quite some time, and they just managed one collecting box in a post office in Norfolk, and that's all they've done for the organisation. But they've done it for like 35 years, and over that period of time, and now I can't remember it's something like 15 grand that they've effectively helped bring in. And it's not a huge role, but it's become a really significant role. And that post office in Norfolk knows about our organisation and knows what we do. And it's it's just one person making actually quite a big impact. Linking that in as much as the actual work that we do more directly is really important, I think. Yeah, and it's trying to keep it away from feeling like a transactional relationship and feeling like they're part of the team.
Yeah, and thank you for being the first guest on the podcast to recognise the title of Time for Impact is about the impact of people giving their time. I'm sure people have recognised it, but you're the first to comment on it, which is really nice. And there were some roles, and you said yourself about the flexibility and people wanting to, not everybody can perhaps commit to large, regular contributions and time commitments. How do you ensure that culture that you talked about, where staff and volunteers are sort of equally respecting each other? Does it go across the board so people realise, even though, as you say, those small contributions of time, whether it's just in this case a fundraising or a less regular volunteer, how that's valued, and I suppose also how do you get that sort of feeling across the staff where actually sometimes the expert will be the volunteer, not a member of staff on the subject matter? Have you managed to sort of get that working nice and seamlessly as a culture?
Well, I think that's a really interesting one. If you go back to RGA, when we were at RGA, that had quite a strong culture of the volunteers being the expert. And one of the things that we got going at RGA, which I felt particularly pleased with, was we got to the point where in almost every case there was a process so that big decisions taken, big pieces of work taken on, were decided and agreed upon by volunteers and staff working together. So there was a culture where it was quite rare, probably outside finance, or I suppose we got treasurers and volunteer trustees involved, but it was quite rare for decisions to be taken that weren't taken jointly by volunteers and head office. And that had a number of impacts. That was quite helpful with people who perhaps other volunteers who maybe didn't like the decision and thought it was kind of, in inverted commas, you staff sitting in your ivory tower making a decision. And we're going, well, actually, it wasn't just us. It was us and the coaching committee, for example, have come up with this change. And ensuring that was work. And also meant you had volunteer advocates who were selling your ideas within their own networks as well, and because of their roles they were normally more influential volunteers. So I think that's a sort of practical way to be doing that, and an important one. I think the other thing is there's recognizing that there's benefit to the volunteer as well. And the benefit to the volunteer will vary according to what the volunteer wants. And I think sometimes charities are a bit shy to shout about the impact on the volunteer of volunteering. And that's actually quite an important point. And you see, again, quite sort of black and white things. You see youth volunteering organisations shouting about the skills you'll get and the benefit you'll get for your CV and that kind of thing. Yeah. And actually, Matt and I did some really... Still proud of that piece of work, Matt, we did at RDA, when we actually did some research into why people volunteer and what the impact is, and came up with some really strong answers, and finding that, older people, retiring people still want to learn and have skills development, that kind of thing. They may not want to do the actual exams and get the certificate on the wall, but they want to feel like they're learning and developing, and that's a real benefit that people are bringing. So understanding all of that and understanding what people's motivations are and what they're getting back out of it, I think think is really important, and then helps you get that. I think the question, it's an interesting one. We're working through at the moment the question of how do you accept and work with the fact that sometimes it's the volunteer that's the expert. And I think where we have, so an example that we will have at Dogs for Good is volunteers who've looked after, say, 7 or 8 dogs. So they've been doing it for quite a long time, and they've got quite a lot of experience. And then as our plans or our policies change, or as what we're trying to do changes, and those volunteers maybe feel that they've got some input to that decision and what's going on, and actually just at the very least, you have a duty to listen to what they've got to say, because they have done it for quite a long time. I think my view is if you're not in agreement with what they're saying, at least you know you're not, and you can work from there. But hopefully you can get some useful feedback from those people.
Well, hopefully, as you described, your culture of co-production will alleviate some of those clashes. I mean, every volunteer particularly volunteers who have been around in an organisation for a long while, get wedded to the way things are doing things, just as staff do. And change is difficult, but if you involve them in the conversations, then that change is always a lot easier. I was interested in what you was kind of alluding to about the almost transactional benefits of volunteering. Some charities almost feel like volunteering should be completely altruistic. You're providing your time because you're wonderful people, which volunteers generally are, but they hide the transactional fact that people are getting some skills and benefits from that experience, if it's just social activity or whatever it is. I don't know quite where the question's going, but I wonder if you've got some thoughts in terms of how we can help the sector move away from thinking that volunteering just has to be a one-way street. People give their time to benefit a cause, but actually the more we can recognize that we're marketing volunteering or marketing the use volunteering as a way to use your spare time, your leisure time, is a marketing exercise, and actually there should be something back in terms of value for volunteers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I suppose first and foremost, I think there's plenty of evidence out there that being altruistic is good for your mental health and your general well-being. I think it's okay to push that. At RDA, because of our research and because of the work actually largely that was led by Matt, but we develop this term of dual benefit, and so the volunteer is delivering benefit and receiving benefit, and we were able to actually be quite clear about what those benefits were, and things like actually reducing loneliness and being part of a team of people with a shared sense of purpose becomes quite important to keep moments of people's lives. I think it's what my lesson there from RDA was actually, I find it quite interesting. We go to the ends of the earth, or a lot of charities do, spend a lot of time and resource on measuring and trying to work out what the impact is of the charity, but forgetting what the impact is for those volunteers, and actually trying to actually quantify that's really important. So we've gone through, at Dogs for Good, we've recently gone through a process of creating a theory of change and allowing us to actually define what our outcomes and our impacts are, and those are all sort of service related. But actually, if you look at some of our impacts, they're around things like reducing social isolation and increasing integration into your society. And we haven't done the work yet, but we're fairly sure that if you give a puppy to a retired person for them to look after for 18 months to 2 years, it improves their sense of connection. When they're in their village, people will talk to them more. We know that's a fact. People will talk to you more if you've got a dog on the end of a lead with you. So for those volunteers, it has a really definite impact. And just really basic stuff. There's a volunteer who I spoke to recently. They had one of our dogs for 18 months. He said at the end of that, they're going to take a break for a year. I saw him about 3 months later, and he'd got another puppy. And I said, "What's happened? Why did you change your mind?" And he said, "Oh, I found without a dog, I just stopped walking, and I put on a stone in about a month. So I wanted another dog because I needed to get back out going for exercise." So that there are those things. So actually being clear about it. I think you have to also be a bit careful that you're not selling volunteering as something that's going to deliver all of those things for people, because I think sometimes people volunteer for lots of different reasons, and very often it's they wouldn't come and volunteer for us because they want to lose weight, but that's that might be a byproduct. And actually one of the interesting things, I think I'm right, Matt, we found at RDA was we thought our research would show that we were helping people become more active. And actually what we found was that, particularly amongst our older cohort of volunteers, we were allowing active people to remain active, which is slightly different. So, but a good benefit in its own right. And actually then that's a benefit that we were able to take to, in that case, Sport England, and say, you need to support us in our volunteering because our volunteering programs enable these people to stay active. Being clear about what the impact is and making some effort to actually quantify it and define it, I think is really important.
Music to my ears as an impact geek, I suppose.
Yeah.
But you know, and actually some of those things are surprising. I always think, because when you, on the face of it, you look at Dogs for Good, you'd think, well, you know, the volunteering impact is obviously the impact on the volunteers. Clearly the volunteers, through the greater Dogs for Good, are impacting on beneficiaries and society. But actually there will be things, for instance, I don't know, but for instance, local councils might want to be boosting social cohesion.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously they're doing that through your beneficiaries of the dogs, but actually they're also getting that through their volunteers doing exactly the same things you described. And sometimes when you do that impact work, you identify opportunities with funders that you just didn't know were there.
Exactly.
You know, or a trust fund that's particularly
Yeah.
driving something about social isolation or mental health or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And by taking the time out to do that impact analysis work, and from a specific volunteering angle, I think my experience is you're actually often quite surprised what you find.
Yeah. And with another interesting example that we have that. So we have a very successful partnership with Alzheimer's Scotland, providing dogs to support people with Alzheimer's. And one of the sort of slightly sadder things that we learned that is our dogs have a working life of about 8 or 9 years, and very often the client either dies or more normally goes into residential care during that time, so the dog doesn't live it out, and the dog then carries on living with that person's partner. We didn't want to be the people who asked for the dog back, so the dogs carried on living with those people. And of course then you have a very different type of person who's living with one of our dogs. They feel very committed and grateful to the charity because they've kept the dog. They've got lived experience of dementia, albeit from a carer's point of view, and they've become the most amazing advocates and volunteers. And so actually we were able to develop a whole second part of our programme for dementia in Scotland around those people who've got involved and sort of quite genuinely want to give back, but also actually are really benefiting from the presence of that dog in there.
I was going to do a slightly self-promoting shout out, really, for anyone that wants to look at the piece of research which we referred to a few times. If you Google horses, health and happiness, that's some of the research we did at RDA, which talks about some of these benefits and the reports there a few years ago now, I think 2018, 2019, but I think probably a lot of the stuff in it feels very relevant to the conversation we're having now, so presumably is still useful. I wondered, Ed, if it was worth changing tack slightly to talk about, I guess, the CEO perspective of sort of investing in kind of volunteer infrastructure or volunteering expertise within an organization. I think that's something that I'm sure charities, or particularly smaller charities that are sort of in the process of growing, and we speak to people from lots of different size charities and organizations here, that will sort of presumably reach a point for lots of those people where actually to make that next step requires a certain level of investment in volunteering. That might be staff, that might be consultancy, that might be expertise. I'd be interested in your sort of reflections on that in the different organizations you've been involved in, and what the benefit of that has been or not, or what the challenges are and how that's out.
So I think I like to think that I'm kind of riding on a wave at just the right moment here, because I think my personal theory on this is that volunteering has lagged behind where I understand fundraising used to be, which is that I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, fundraising was largely about contacts, and it was quite an undeveloped sector within the charitable sector. And then people started realizing that actually, firstly, if you actually invest in it and put some time and effort into it, you get a bit more money, and then the whole thing professionalized a bit. And I think volunteering has followed the same route to some extent. Interestingly, a certain kind of feel like I'm riding it along. It's everywhere I've worked. It seems to me I've arrived at a place that has absolutely no infrastructure around volunteering and volunteering support or management. As you know, Matt, because you were it. we've put that in place, and interestingly, Dogs for Good, it was pretty minimal, and we've expanded that quite a lot. And I think sometimes there can be a kind of view that volunteers, not quite that volunteers grow on trees, but volunteers will just appear and keep on appearing, and that's fine, and a certain level of churn and throughput is okay. And actually what I'd like to see is a part of my one team approach would be a commitment to actually looking after your volunteers and supporting your volunteers in the same way that you would your paid staff. So when I say the same way, that you give them the same level of value, you might do it in different ways. So simple things. If you're asking a volunteer to do something, they should have the opportunity to be trained up and feel competent to do it before you ask them to do it. They may feel competent before they start, but I think particularly for sort of smaller and medium-sized charities, it can feel like quite a lot of investment in something. But I think it really does pay dividends. And I think it was interesting to me when I started at Dogs for Good. It was kind of like a real gift, actually. But two of our volunteers had done quite a lot of research with a member of our staff who was our volunteer coordinator in the year before I arrived. They'd gone out and taken it upon themselves to get feedback from our volunteers, and some of it was really positive. It by all means wasn't all positive, as anyone would expect, but I arrived with a whole lot of data about our volunteers, and it allowed us to fairly quickly put a 10-point plan in place and say, right, in the first year, here are 10 things we're going to do with and for our volunteers. Several of my colleagues cursed, and there was me thinking some of those things were really simple, and they turned out, the really simple thing sounds like it's really simple, and then you actually try and do it and realise it's the most complicated one. But by and large, we were able to do that, and that proved the point. In terms of our volunteer surveys, we were able to improve the feedback from our volunteers fairly rapidly and fairly significantly. Quite a lot of that was just through better communication, but also we invested in a head of volunteering. We invested in actually putting some money behind that role and actually getting things moving, so that actually there's you recognise there is a resource there that's an important resource there, and it needs to be nurtured and managed. And I think so, as you say, whether it's staff or consultancy or resourcing the whole area, or probably a combination of all those three, in the same way that no one nowadays would say it's really odd to employ someone to do fundraising. No one should find it odd to employ someone to support your volunteer network. And I think the final point in this, I think, is the other thing which I think is a real risk for charities if you don't do it, is you end up with your operational staff managing your volunteers. And that's where you then get back to, as we were talking earlier, I think, where volunteers can start to feel like the relationship's very transactional, because your ops manager needs this puppy delivered from here to here, so can we find a volunteer driver who can take it there? And it becomes just about that, rather than actually thinking and listening about what your volunteers want to do, and having someone who can focus on the volunteers themselves. So it's never wasted money. And I think from my point of view, we're on quite a big growth agenda at Dogs for Good, and a lot of that is driven by increasing the engagement of our volunteers. And you can't just do that without that additional support and resource.
The other bit I've observed, Ed, to just build on that, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I've always noticed that you're someone who's really ensured that some expertise around that is present, not just sort of in a paid capacity in the organisation, but also on the board as well. So you've not just got an investment at a sort of a staff level, but also at a strategic board level to try and really drive that stuff forward, because that's important too. I don't know if I'm right in that, but I've always observed that anyway.
No, I think that's really important. So alongside having people who've experienced the benefit of the charity on your board, I think charities that engage with volunteers should have a volunteer on the board. And I've heard, and it annoys me if I'm honest, but I've heard people saying, well, the board are all volunteers themselves, so why do we need a different person who's a volunteer? And it's like, the actual experience of being that volunteer fundraiser, volunteering driver, whatever it is, I think is really important. And this is actually something I learned best, actually, I think, at RDA, where more than half of the board were volunteers who had, if you like, come up through the organisation. And there were numerous ways of ending up on the RDA board, but quite a few of them were elected volunteers who came up through the system, and that has strengths and weaknesses. But by and large, it's a real strength because you've got people who really understand the organisation. And if you don't have it, then very quickly the board can become very distanced from those volunteers, and the volunteers notice that pretty quickly. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think it's something that's really important.
Absolutely. I was wondering, Ed, if you had just flipping it slightly, view on how we develop the career paths of volunteerism professionals, because it does feel, as you described, there are quite a number of, I won't name any organisations, but quite a number of quite large, well-known volunteering organisations in the UK who have very, very small volunteering teams, and sometimes without the heads of volunteering even, or a head of who is on their own, therefore really is doing all the operations as well as the strategic thinking. And I actually take it a step further. There's very few volunteering professionals who seem to make it to executive levels. There's very few director volunteering posts. There's a handful of us who have sort of held HR and volunteering director roles, but there's not many that break through that glass ceiling. And I wonder if that's a problem, first of all, but assuming that it is, what the profession itself can do to strengthen their own career paths and ensure that we break through that ceiling in the future.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting question, and we've brought volunteering into our people team. So yeah, volunteering sits in the same directorate as HR, and I think I've seen in a number of places, as a charity where I'm involved as a trustee, where the HR director has effectively applied HR science, if I can call it that, volunteering, and it becomes very kind of policy and procedure driven. I think one needs to be a bit careful about that. It strikes me actually that it's a really fantastic training for an HR person to go and spend some time managing and running volunteering, where that emotional contract is actually what drives everything, not just the actual physical contract. So I think that said, I think there's quite a lot to be learned from if you like, formalised people management and for the volunteering sector. And I guess I haven't thought a lot about this, but I would like to see in the same way, I suppose, as I said, around fundraising, where you've seen the development of professional qualifications, and you could argue fundraising's like sales and marketing, and it could have been led down that way, and they seem to have taken some of those principles and applied them to that, and actually come up with more structured training qualifications of their own. And seeing that for volunteer management and recognising it as a skill in its own right, because I do think it's different. And I think one of the things, and Matt, you'll have experienced this at RDA, one of the things that volunteering people have to do is just recognise that sometimes it takes 20 minutes to have a 5-minute phone call, because one of the things the volunteer gets out of it is they want to tell you what they did at their session yesterday. That's it. Their relationship with the organisation is much more like that, and that's a really small thing. But if you start to over professionalize that out, that's a problem. So I think actually understanding where volunteering is different and how the qualifications can develop, I think is quite important. Yeah, and I'm not aware of any actual decent qualifications for volunteering leads. No. I think that would then push it up the agenda a bit. So those big organisations can actually start to have significant high-level roles for volunteering professionals alongside everybody else.
Yeah, in North America, they have a thing called a CVA. There is a qualification, a recognised or at least sort of chartered status for qualified volunteer professionals, but there's not anything really equivalent in the UK. I think there's a value in that. But I wonder, there's something for the CEOs to do to sort of promote the sort of things you described in terms around volunteering, but I think there's maybe something for the volunteering professional as well, to be, I always think you've got to find your own solution sometimes, not wait for your CEO to do it for you. And
Yeah.
I wonder, as a CEO, what sort of things you look for in a volunteering professional in terms of moving into that sort of strategic space.
So I think well, I suppose I think it's what I want to see and what we're trying to develop is a volunteering strategy that backs and underpins our main organisational strategy. So that's where it's my role and the board's role. We can set very broad targets of what we want to achieve, but actually then how do we actually go forward and deliver our operational objectives and our ambitions, and how do we engage volunteers in helping us do that? Getting this, for us, it's more of a people plan than just a volunteer plan, and it's about that, how the staff team and the volunteer team can work together. So we're pivoting the way we work to include more volunteers to do a bit more, and that requires the staff to change as well. So what you need from your volunteering lead, so we have a head of volunteering, and what I need from that person is someone who can advocate to the rest of the organisation about how the volunteers are going to bring those ambitions to reality, and how that's going to allow our staff to do more and do better, hopefully. So I guess it's a strange mix of somebody who's able to step back and be quite strategic and put that plan together and see the bigger picture, but then actually get involved and start influencing people and delivering that.
It strikes me as kind of one of the key components of, perhaps the sort of philosophy of like one team, right? If you want to get all of this stuff functioning together as one team, working well together, you sort of inevitably need to see people as a joined up function and understand what everyone's role is, right? And so for all of that stuff to come together, you need to think about it together, seems to me, rather than too much as sort of distinct component parts. And I suppose coming back to the volunteering piece, right? Maybe volunteering professionals, maybe we need to get out of our lane a little bit more sometimes. Absolutely. As well, which I think for a long time we've been hoping other people will get out of their lanes and come and find out about what volunteering's like. But maybe there's a challenge for us as well. If real success here is, as you're saying, Ed, is like we need one team, we need everyone to work together in an effective partnership as a joined up approach. Yes, there's stuff about paid staff which is unique. Yes, there's stuff about volunteering which is unique, but the real magic happens when all of that stuff comes together. Feels to me like to be a key part of making that all work, really. And if you start with that philosophy, you'll inevitably end up in a sort of more strategic, more how do we bring all of this together space.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think certainly that plays back to what I mentioned earlier at RGA, where we got to that philosophy of basically volunteers and staff made decisions jointly and together. Matt, you'll remember we worked with a really brilliant chair called Sam Ord, and Sam was really almost religious about that idea of like, well, where's the volunteer input to this, or where's the staff input to this, and that builds that strength. So I think there's a duty on, well, in terms of volunteering becoming a bit more structured in terms of, or volunteer management becoming more structured in terms of its training and its education and development of its people. There's definitely something to be learned from outside volunteering, but I suppose my point would be, without losing what I think is volunteering has a sort of special spirit about it, which needs to be protected.
Yeah. But I think the sector, personally, my experience, can get a little bit siloed within organisations, and I think there is definitely some value in, even if it's just a conference or a few days or a few weeks or a few projects where you're really collaborating across those borders, really does make a difference. Because, as somebody who spent most of their time in volunteering, I would say there's a hell of a lot we can learn from fundraising, for instance. There's so much as a profession that we can learn from other teams.
I think it's changing now as well. So we're in the midst of battling the implementation of new systems and IT and things that make all of things like volunteer stewardship. You compared earlier, Matt, to kind of fundraising, and it brings it closer to that, as you're saying, Chris. Yeah. And actually just how you do steward volunteers and how you do respond to things that they're saying, or perhaps sometimes don't respond, but make it sure that they're getting out of it what they want.
I know it's a weird tangent, but I always remember my days as a hotel manager, my boss, who was the sort of group director, and and CEO of the hotel, really insisting that all the different departments, the leisure suite, the restaurant, the front desk and stuff, all came to the same meeting and critiqued, not so much critique, that sounds like they're telling each other, but we really went over finding solutions for each other's challenges. And if the leisure team could find a solution to a problem in the bar, that's all well and good. And that sort of cross-fertilization of ideas and seeing the customer, who of course was in all those places, from different perspectives, was so valuable. And I think I saw the same when I worked with you, Matt, at M&D Association with Sally Light. She pulled us all together as an executive team, and I struggled to talk about medical research particularly convincingly, but all the other departments, we all mixed in and we all helped solve those problems. And I think that had so much value to the way we worked.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'd say also there's I guess we're coming into the sort of CEO role here, aren't we? Right? What's the role of a CEO in sort of making all of this happen, I suppose? And I think as someone who's been involved in, I suppose we've called out 2 organizations there that I've had the pleasure of being involved in, right? That I think my perspective as the volunteering professional in those organizations, one of the key sort of leadership pieces that that's always been created there that's so important is that sort of leadership from the top of going, volunteering is important, making decisions together is important, trusting volunteers is important. I think almost all of the stuff we've talked about today is a leadership piece, right? I suppose this is my call out for any CEOs listening, is if you can champion this kind of stuff, it makes people that do what I do, it makes our job so much easier because we don't have to convince people of it being important. And I hear other people in the sector having to have that battle. I've never had to have that battle. That's something I've been really fortunate not to have. I suppose I'm really grateful to you, Ed, for all of that. But I think it's something that is special and isn't everywhere and is important to call out, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start in a new role, you never get everything right immediately. One of the things that I perhaps didn't get right at Dogs for Good was I was quite out there and adamant about, as I said at the top of this, being a volunteerist and wanting to see volunteers play a bigger part in the role of the organisation. Then, as I said, we rolled out our 10-point plan and we responded quite a lot. And I think quite a few of my paid colleagues felt that we were putting too much emphasis on volunteering and not enough on them. And I put my hands up and say that might be right. But actually, I can justify it because I think the volunteering need was a bit more critical. And of course, it's easier for volunteers just to walk away if they're unhappy. And it's a big part of it. I think where we are now, a year or so further on, I think exactly as you say, Matt, I think I'm a big believer that as a leader, if you stand up and say things to people enough times, they start to actually become true, providing they're reasonable things in the first place. So I think we now see that happening, and there's now an acceptance that we're bringing more volunteers in and that volunteers are going to do a bit more. And we've got a youth volunteer program coming along and those other things. But actually, I suppose linking it up, in order to do that, you actually have to invest in the area as well. So you have to put some resource behind your words, because otherwise you just end up with busy people trying to do their day job, feeling that this thing's being bolted on, which is no good for anyone, least of all the volunteers, because they're not getting a poor experience. I think volunteering does need to be shouted out and shouted about more. And I think the risk is sounding a bit sort of pompous, but so much what happens in the UK is driven by volunteers, and there's so much that happens with volunteers. I know, Matt, you've been involved with Scouts, and I've been involved in sport and things like that. Pretty much the whole of British sport is underpinned by volunteers, and a good volunteering experience, we know, delivers success in sport. So I think one of my all-time favourite volunteer stories, which you may remember, Matt, was hearing Natasha Baker, who was a Paralympic gold medalist, and tell the story of having seen in 2000 Lee Pearson win a gold medal at the Sydney Olympics and go in for her riding session the next day, tell that story aged 10 to her volunteer coach, who then said, okay, well, today let's not ride, let's sit down and write a plan as to how you're going to get yourself to the Olympics. And I know that volunteer, and I know he was cheating because he knew she was already an amazing rider. But she talks about the fact that volunteer took her seriously, that volunteer enabled that to happen. Her journey was completely underpinned by volunteers. So there's an amazing thing that's happening that if we don't manage it and actually deal with it properly, risks either either not delivering the benefit it could bring, or actually worse than that, actually falling away a bit, particularly as we see the pressure now on volunteering, all the pressures that we know about that we see on volunteering.
Well, you've said quite a few things already this evening, Ed, that I would certainly put on my checklist for CEOs to promote volunteering. You've talked about fostering shared purpose, investing in volunteering, importance of co-production and trust, valuing and measuring the value of volunteering. I don't think you've talked about it, but I think it's been there throughout, but kind of visibility of the CEO in the volunteering world. Certainly you've been pushing a big mantra around volunteering. I mean, those alone I'd love to see in many, many CEOs across the sector, and I'm sure you'd add to that list.
Yeah,
Ed and I have probably got lots of stories about various volunteer meetings we've been to together over the years, so probably not all suitable for this podcast, but certainly lots of visiting for sure.
I guess the final thing I'd say, without wanting to end on a downer, but I think the other thing which I've learned, and where there's a piece to be played, is you do get senior when I say senior volunteers who are experienced and who do from time to time sadly overstep the mark. And I think there's a real role for a leadership to play, whether it's the CEO or the people director or who, but to back up the team in sometimes being robust with volunteers, and not this idea that just because somebody's volunteering you can't say actually no. And I've found a number of occasions one of our best volunteers is somebody who had just said, right, we're doing it like this, and if you don't want to do it like this, then I'm really sorry, but just don't come along with us. I think that robustness of management is something that particularly, I guess, because quite often one sees volunteering led by not always the most experienced person in the team. So you need to be there to actually back that up on those very rare occasions where it doesn't go perfectly.
And I guess that brings us back to this idea of a partnership, right? Which is like actually getting that partnership right is everyone understands what their place in the system is. Everyone's respectful of each other. Everyone is following the values of the organization or whatever. And that's when the magic happens. That's when good stuff happens in terms of.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of work at Dogs for Good trying to define that. We've redefined, rather than having values, we've ended up with something called our promise, which is a 3-point promise that we make to ourselves and our colleagues, our clients and our dogs, and it defines the way we want to work, and that applies every much as to volunteers as it does to staff. There's no difference between that.
Yeah. Well, if you're valuing people equally, then sometimes you have to challenge people equally too.
Yeah.
And but I'm really pleased you said it, because that is the flip side. You do sometimes find in some of the best volunteering CEOs, they're so pro volunteering that they sometimes do struggle to criticise volunteers. And yeah, you've got to get that balance right, and you've got to support your staff who are managing human behaviour on a daily basis, which is one of the most difficult skills. And that's very, very difficult if you just try and get a line right and then somebody sort of circumvents them and goes to the CEO who gives a different line. But no, that is really important, and I know volunteering professionals would appreciate that as well. So thank you, Ed. It's been fascinating talking to you. It's been heartwarming hearing the stories of both volunteering as well as the causes that you represented. It's great to hear from a CEO who clearly really gets volunteering and volunteerism and is an advocate and a fan and a supporter of and a champion of those things. So thank you for that, but also thank you for coming on the podcast.
No, not at all. It's been fun and interesting to reflect on some of this stuff as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks, Ed. Bye-bye. Well, Chris, another podcast down. And from my perspective, it was really, really great to speak to Ed again. I worked with Ed for 8 years writing for the Disabled Association. And, I was really, really fortunate to be part of a culture with such sort of brilliant leadership that was conducive to such effective volunteer engagement. And I think for me, that really came across in the podcast today. Ed, from my perspective, is a CEO that really understands this, really values it, really wants to invest in it. And so he's someone that really believes in the power of people that are paid, the power of people that give their time, and the importance in bringing all of that together and getting it to work effectively. I think that's really good from my perspective. What were some of the things that you took away from today, or you're reflecting on after our conversation?
Yeah, exactly that, really, Matt. I mean, you know Ed better than I do. You've worked with him, but he comes across as such a genuine, authentic leader that understands and values volunteering, which isn't always the norm. There was a good and as bad as there are in any sector, and Ed really comes across as one of the good ones. Right from the start, he was talking about seeing staff and volunteering working together in partnership of equal value, shared purpose. He talked about co-production and involving volunteers and volunteering professionals in scoping everything that the organisation does. He's clearly interested in capturing the value of volunteering, both to society, to the volunteers, recognizing that the volunteers, do draw value from their experience. He's clearly he's got a track record of investing in volunteering and realizing that this stuff doesn't come for free, and you need professionals to deliver volunteering functions in organizations, and you need enough of them to make a difference if you are a volunteering organization. So it's a breath of fresh air, wasn't it? It's really nice to hear that. And I think if any aspiring CEOs taking over an organization that has volunteering as a major component of how they do things, or wants to build lived experience better into their charity activities, then I think they can do a lot worse than follow the blueprint or listen and learn from Ed.
Totally agree. Well, there we go. Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Another great, really interesting podcast, and I'm looking forward to the next. And if anybody wants to suggest future podcast guests or want to put themselves forward, please do reach out to us at Time for Impact, www.timeforimpact.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. And if you like what you hear, first of all, share it with somebody else, because we want to share the podcast as wide and far as we can. And if you're feeling very generous, do give us a rating, preferably a positive one. We'd appreciate that. Until the next time, thanks for listening.